Well, hello, everyone. My name is Kyle. Let me welcome you to Uplift. If you're joining us online or on our podcast, we're so glad that you found us. We are in a series called Boundaries. In fact, this is our last message in this series. Through the course of the previous few weeks, I've sought to give us some good information so we can be proactive before we face difficulties and maybe carve out some good spaces for us to heal. Next week, we begin a new series. I'm just calling it Hope because boy, don't we need some hope. We need some hope. We believe in a gospel of hope, even when things feel hopeless. It's going to be a little bit of a theological series. I don't want that to scare you. We're going to talk about some really deep theological subjects. We're going to look at the story of hope as found in two books of the Bible, Genesis and Revelation. We're going to be in other places, but we're primarily going to be in the first book and the last book to kind of show you that the story of hope bookends our experience and the Lord's experience here on planet Earth. I want to encourage you to come back next week. I want you to imagine for a moment that you're walking through a museum, and each room has carefully curated pieces of art. And for the most part, you're seeing the work of well-known artists. You're familiar with the names. Now, I want you to imagine being in this museum, the doors suddenly swing open, and anyone from the street is invited to put their artwork on the walls. No curator, no filter. You start seeing pieces that range from the beautiful to the bizarre. And really, that's the best way I know to describe what happens on Instagram. I hope you're familiar with Instagram. If you're not, it's a photo and video posting application. It's owned by the company called Meta. Meta also owns Facebook. Now, Instagram has this feature called Reels. And Reels are just short little videos. And right now, I've found it as well. People are discovering that your Instagram feed is covered and flooded with randomness, where anything can appear on your screen, whether it belongs there or not. There's actually a name for this. There's a name for this. Can you believe this? It's called the mythical pull. The mythical pull. Don't you? I told you, it's Beethoven and it's all kinds of cool cultural terms. The mythical pull. The mythical pull is video that's in your feed that's so strange you can't believe you're seeing it, and you wonder if you're even supposed to be watching it. You don't even know what it is. Here's why that's happening. The head of Instagram, his name is Adam Mosseri. Over the past few months, he's began focusing on elevating smaller creators in the Reels algorithm. By the way, that's a weird algorithm. I'll tell you more about my algorithm in a minute. It's like Instagram has decided to open those museum doors and just let everyone in and let everyone hang their artwork on the walls of your feed. Mosseri explained that this change was designed to give every video, no matter how small the creator, a chance to be seen. But that has some interesting effects because Instagram and other social media accounts, and you probably know this, they're notorious for spiking our dopamine levels. I want to show you a book. It's called The Dopamine Nation, and it's written by one of the world's leading experts on addiction. Her name is Dr. Anna Lembke. And she writes in this book that we're all addicts now. We're all addicts. And she says that our smartphones are, and this is her phrase in the book, modern day hypodermic needles. That's a pretty extreme statement. But she says that because our smartphones give us quick dopamine hits as we chase likes and swipes and tweets. And behavioral addictions, scrolling Instagram, binging TikTok, online gambling, you name it, they're soaring. And with them, so is our collective unhappiness. And Dr. Lemke points out the irony here. We've never had more fun at our fingertips, yet global depression rates keep climbing. We've forgotten how to be alone with our thoughts. That's what she writes. We constantly interrupt ourselves for the next digital hit. And what she says, and I think she's right, is that the biggest addiction in the world right now is distraction. Distraction. There's a term for this behavior, by the way, for consistently going to the well of social media for these quick dopamine hits. You may have heard it. It's called doom scrolling. Doom scrolling. That's a really ominous word. This word showed up in 2020 at the exact moment that the world seemed to buckle beneath the weight of a pandemic. Doom scrolling describes our tendency to endlessly consume not just content, but even the bad stuff. Psychologist and researcher Dr. Susan Albers explains that it's more than just a habit, it's a cycle. We often tell ourselves that we're staying informed, but really we're seeking validation for negative feelings. This is a quote from an article I read where she was quoted. She says, when we're depressed, we look for information that confirms how we feel. So we just stay on it. We just keep scrolling. So what happens is because we're addicted to distraction, this doom scrolling becomes an automatic thing in our life. We scroll without thinking. We lose time. We plan to only look at a couple of things on our phone for a couple of minutes, and then an hour later, we're still on our phone. And we're oblivious to the world around us. We don't even know what's going on. And that's pretty critical because there are some people with some obsessive compulsive tendencies that use doom scrolling to manage their anxiety, even as it reinforces the negativity. I want you to listen to what Dr. Susan Albers says. This is a quote from her. Your brain gets stuck on a particular topic, much like endless scrolling. It's less about getting the facts. It's more about trying unsuccessfully to soothe your anxiety. Now, why are we talking about this? Well, here's why. Social media is positioned very well to show us exactly how far our boundaries extend. That's why we're talking about it. Because it seems that our boundaries are fairly elastic, or they may even be porous. And we actually know this because of another trend in social media. It's called confusion baiting. Kind of a test case in how far we can stretch our boundaries or what we're willing to break them for. Social media researcher Emily Hund explains that modern content creators have mastered a new strategy of getting your attention, really extending your boundaries. They produce videos that leave you guessing. You're unsure whether even what you're looking at is authentic. These creators aren't trying to shock you or upset you. That trend is kind of past. They just want to make you stop and wonder what you're seeing is real. And what happens is when you're wondering if it's real, those videos just keep playing. And the more confused you are, the more you watch, and the more successful the video becomes. Our interaction with this stuff is really a great case study in what we're willing to tolerate and what we're willing to break our boundaries for. And here's why, because social media, looking at social media stuff, it's a very private experience. No one really sees what we're watching. We scroll through those feeds when we're alone, when we feel like small compromises can be contained or managed or even mitigated. And all the while, the research is pretty clear. Our brains have trouble putting our phones down. They just can't do it. We stay on those sites and those apps for way too long, and we ingest content for no particular reason and at unhealthy levels. And this cycle and addiction of distraction, it reduces our boundaries to dust in a very private way. We find ourselves giving value and time to understanding things that were never even meant to make sense. And we spend that time finding validation from things that just aren't healthy. And this distraction, boy, it's really subtle. We stay engaged in the trivial and away from what really matters. And let me just kind of, as an aside, say this. I'm not shaming any of us for scrolling Instagram Reels because I do it. In fact, my algorithm is so weird. I like to get on Instagram, and I particularly love videos about singers. There's some really great vocalists in the world, but for some reason, about a month ago, in the middle of my singers, I start seeing reels about gorillas. And I have no idea where that came from. So I would just keep scrolling until I found somebody else singing. I have no problem with that. I don't want to shame you for that. I watch them. I send the funny ones to my family members. It's cheap entertainment. I'm not referencing that sort of harmless interaction. I'm referencing the type of interaction that makes us tear down the boundaries we've built. Because I really see this behavior as a blue dye test for our boundaries. It's a microcosm of something much larger in our lives. We readily tear down boundaries when we want, and we realize the difficulty of restoring them. In fact, one leading therapist thinks we need a dopamine detox, a fast from podcasts and videos and Netflix and video games and Instagram and all that stuff. Fasting is hard. It hurts, but it helps set boundaries again because we need good boundaries. And detox is a good word for building those boundaries or rebuilding them. It's just a reset. It's a moment to reclaim your life for the glory of God. But I think we need to be realists. We need to expect a couple of things when we rebuild our boundaries. So this message is really what happens next after we rebuild and restore the boundaries we've let crumble. Just two things. First, when we set boundaries, we should expect resistance. That's what's going to happen next, and it's going to happen fast. Resistance to you reclaiming space is going to happen fast. And it's no surprise, really, because when you build a fence around your life, you're not just marking territory, you're challenging the status quo. You're declaring your independence in a world that demands you stay compliant. And relationally, this is going to be noticed pretty quickly. When you establish healthy limits in your relationships, you're reclaiming a power that others have held over you. And when people feel that power slipping away, they don't take it lying down. Resistance will happen both externally and internally. Let's talk about both of these. First, let's talk about external resistance. And for this, we're going to return to Nehemiah. If you have your Bibles, you can turn to Nehemiah chapter 4. We're just going to read one verse from there, but you might want to see it. Now, let's talk about Nehemiah. We talked about him past couple of weeks. He's the builder of a boundary, of a wall around Jerusalem. And we're going to use that story as a metaphor again. Now, a little bit about him. He's from the city of Susa in Persia. And he heard that the walls of Jerusalem, the city of his heritage, were gone. In fact, they'd been torn down for 150 years. The city's been left completely defenseless. So he traveled 1,000 miles from Jerusalem from Susa to Jerusalem to specifically rebuild those walls. And he faced some monumental pushback from this, which is fascinating. Let's read this from Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 1. Nehemiah wrote, "Now when Sanballat," that's the guy's name, "when Sanballat heard that we were building the wall, he was angry and greatly enraged, and he jeered at the Jews." We got a new guy, a new character in the story, Sanballat. He bursts on the scene in this story like a storm. Before Nehemiah ever arrived, Sanballat had actually taken over the city, imposed his will on Jerusalem for all the people who were left there. And when he learned that Nehemiah was working to rebuild the walls of the city, his anger was palpable. He was furious because his sense of power was threatened. And Nehemiah's endeavor, he's doing a good thing. Nehemiah's endeavor to lay the foundations for a new wall and a new Jerusalem was a direct challenge to Sanballat's authority. This is a familiar story in our lives. When we begin to assert ourselves by the grace and the mercy of Jesus and by the leading of the Spirit of God, when we begin to do this, those who have grown accustomed to dominating our time and our energy react with anger. It's happened in my life. I felt it. They're threatened. They're angry. They're furious because you are prioritizing your own well-being over their needs. Now look, we've said this repeatedly. Our purpose in this life is to glorify God in all things. That's it. And our boundaries help us do that to the fullest. Boundaries are a clear way to communicate that we no longer live to glorify the people in our orbit. That's the external resistance. Here's the internal resistance. We doom scroll through life. You've done it. I've done it. We do it like we do it on our social media accounts. We're looking at and we're entertaining one confusing and bad scenario after another. We lean into the mythical pool of others and their response and their validation. And we've got some pretty good reason for this. There is a natural resistance that bubbles up from within us when we begin to set limits. And it actually stems from our unmet needs. Those deep, intrinsic human desires for affirmation and love and acceptance and connection and validation. God created us with those needs. They're divine. and they're meant to be nurtured by our families and our communities and our faith. Yet far too many of us walk through life with these fundamental needs unmet. So we doom scroll, we cross boundaries, we seek validation in the first person or thing that offers a glimmer of it. We might work extra hours. We might enter into some destructive relationships. We might cling to some unhealthy coping mechanism. And we do all of that in the name of finding that sense of belonging. In our vulnerability, we become prone to compromising our convictions. And we bend our boundaries to satisfy those unfulfilled needs. And listen, if you find yourself grappling with voids in your heart, I want you to listen to the words of the Apostle Paul again from Philippians chapter 4, verse 19. My God, he wrote from a jail cell, my God will supply every single one of your needs according to the riches of his glory. Now, this statement from Paul actually reveals a couple of truths. The first one is that you have some unmet needs. You got needs that need to be met. That's a truth. And two, only God can meet those needs. Two big truths. And he's met those in Jesus. But if you're a skeptic like me, the first question you're going to ask is, how does he do that? How? How does he do that? I want to introduce a theological term to you, and it's this. It's the term impassibility. I encourage you to write this down. Google it later. There's a whole lot more that we can say about this, but I don't have time. Impassibility. Now, impassibility is a theological word. It's a theological doctrine, actually. And it means this, that God does not experience emotional change in any way. His emotions don't fluctuate or change. If you define this word literally, it means that God is without passions, impassibility. He's impassioned. It's an attribute of God that distinguishes the infinite and eternal creator from the finite and temporal creation. And this doctrine of impassibility means God is impassible by his very nature, He doesn't choose to be impassible. He just is. Impassibility is intrinsic to his very being. Maybe this is how you can better understand it. So John writes the letter that we know as 1 John, and he writes a very famous passage in that letter, a very famous definition about God. He writes, God is love. What he doesn't write in that book is God chooses to love. He writes, God is love. Now, I want to tell you what Christian theological professor Matthew Barrett, this is what he says about this. If God is love, then his love could not be more infinite in its loveliness. What that means is that his divine love can't change. Can't change. There's another side to impassibility, and it's this. Being impassible also means that God is not swayed by suffering. He isn't vulnerable to pain. He can't feel pain. Now, it's a lot of word salad probably for a lot of us. That's why I want you to Google it later if you want to. And that's okay if some of that just seems a little iffy. That's okay. But let me provide some clarity for you. If God is impassible, and I think he is, then God can only experience the emotional changes of his creation by becoming his creation. That's a big deal. That's a big deal. Because God is limited by his very nature. He could not and cannot feel our pain and our suffering. His very essence means that he's not human. He can't feel it the way we feel it. So to feel what we feel, he had to become human. And that's the whole point of Jesus. That's it. In fact, the first generation of believers affirm this. Let's read this. This is from Hebrews chapter 2. Look at this. But we see him who for a little while was made lower than the angels, namely Jesus, crowned with glory and honor because, look at that word, because of the suffering of death, so that by the grace of God, he might taste death for everyone. God had to become human to understand and taste death. That's what the writer of Hebrews says. God, without being Jesus, had never tasted that kind of pain. He couldn't, but he can as a human, and he can defeat it because he's God. That's what impassibility means. And it's precisely because of this that only God can truly fulfill the deepest longings of your heart. When Paul writes that my God can satisfy and supply every one of your needs, this is what he's talking about. Because God has created you to feel those longings. He's created you to feel them. And through Jesus, he knows what they feel like. He gets it. He's tasted them. That means he can only meet them. Only he can do it. By the way, there's evidence of this truth, and it's experiential. You know this. You can try to find fulfillment in people or occupations or stuff or just fill in the blank. You can do it. You've chased it, and I've chased it, and we've all come away unfulfilled. It's experiential. Only the God of the universe, your creator, through Jesus, can meet those unfulfilled desires. Your worship and your adoration of God and your fellowship with the believers meets those needs. It meets them. It's wise for us when we build boundaries to expect resistance. But God can satisfy whatever you think you're going to lack. Here's the second thing we should expect. When we set boundaries, we should also expect joy. Joy. Boundaries aren't about saying no to distractions. They're about saying yes to what really matters. That's the whole point of this message series. Boundaries redefine what joy is and where to find it, where we find it. And we should expect it. We should expect joy. Setting boundaries is not meant to be a solemn experience. There's goodness to be had. I want you to listen to Psalm chapter 37, verse 4, where David wrote, "Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will fulfill the desires of your heart." As promised, this is an interesting chapter, by the way. It's a Psalm of David. It's written as an acrostic, which means that every couple of lines, especially in our English translation, if we were to parse it out, every couple of lines begins with the corresponding letter of the Hebrew alphabet. It says, if David wrote this to be easily memorized, right? Easy instruction, quick truths. Here's the context. Here's what's going on. Here's why this verse was written. Psalm chapter 37. David's audience wondered, you and I wonder the same thing, why evil and selfish people seem to thrive while the righteous don't. And David's message was pretty simple. Not always welcomed, but it's pretty simple. This is it. Life isn't measured by short-term successes. That's the point. And his antidote to this sort of envy is to delight in the Lord. That's a Hebrew word. Anag means delight. It's not just a nice idea. It's a command. It's an action. It's an imperative to take joy in God, to consciously turn our hearts toward enjoying the Lord, not enjoying things or circumstances, but the Lord. It's less about feeling pleasure and more about learning to find contentment in the presence of Jesus. But we really misunderstand Psalm 37:4 if we reduce it to a transaction. If we just think if we're a good Christian, God's going to give us everything we want. God is not transactional. He's not. Delighting in the Lord is an imperative to reshape our desires until they align with God. In fact, when we truly delight in the Lord, our desires shift. They stop being about what the world values and they become centered on what God values. The promise of Psalm chapter 37, verse 4, it's not about getting what we want. It's about wanting what we get when our hearts rest on God. But I think it's okay to provide a word of caution, even though we are to expect joy. because God is aware. He's very aware of manufactured delight. Very aware of it. I want you to look with me in Isaiah chapter 58. We're going to read the first 3 verses. The Lord says this to Isaiah, "Cry aloud, don't hold back, lift up your voice like a trumpet, declare to my people their transgression, to the house of Jacob their sins, yet they seek me daily, and they delight to know my ways as if they were a nation that did righteousness and did not forsake the judgment of their God. They ask of me righteous judgments. They delight to draw near to God." Why have we fasted and you see it not? Why have we humbled ourselves and you take no knowledge of it? Behold, in the day of your fast, you seek your own pleasure and you oppress all of your workers. Manufactured delight, y'all, is nothing but appeasement. It's idolatry. It's idolatry. Manufactured delight is a hologram of a boundary. It's seeking the glory of yourself over the glory of God. You're just box checking. Psalm chapter 37 speaks about soul satisfaction. Delight in the Lord, and you'll find that the fulfillment of your deepest longings is already yours, because those desires, those longings were always meant to be found in Him. You'll find that joy again doing what you're made to do. In fact, chasing after other pursuits, delighting in things other than God is actually a net loss. When we allow fear to dictate our choices, we sacrifice our well-being and we compromise our purpose of glorifying God and enjoying Him. Listen, as we wrap this series up, don't let yourself be held hostage by the fear of loss or unmet needs. Don't let the fear of losing a relationship, of upsetting someone, or of being alone stop you from setting healthy limits. Let God deal with those deep, lingering fears, because only He can do it. He's felt it. He's made them. He's decided to feel them. He became human to feel them. And that resistance that you're going to face from others, whether it comes in the form of blame or guilt or anger or fear, it doesn't outweigh the importance of protecting your own heart and your own soul and your own purpose. Let's kind of wrap this up by talking about Nehemiah again, because he knew all this in a really tangible way. He faced resistance, but he pressed on with an inner resolve, a deep desire for change. He didn't cave to the pressure or allow fear to dictate his course. He understood what truly mattered was not appeasing others, but fulfilling the purpose that God had set before them. And look, you can read it. He built those walls with a hammer in one hand and a sword in the other. This is what we're doing. Stand firm in your convictions. Don't compromise your boundaries or your well-being out of fear. Trust that God will supply your needs and guide you through the resistance from others and yourself. There's a deep, abiding joy that's awaiting you. It's waiting to be yours. Praise the Lord for that.